We've all seen the GoPro release videos and thought, wow, that looks amazing. I'm gonna get one so I can capture cool footage to share with my friends. Then your GoPro arrives, you test it out, and 9 out of 10 times, the footage isn't the greatest. The regular GoPros are one thing, but the 360 GoPros seem to be even more limited on good quality due to the fact that you can't run ND filters and your shutter speed is limited. But luckily there are a few tips we can implement to help us get past these limiting factors and give us footage that we're actually stoked on. The first and most obvious tip is going to be knowing your settings and having them dialed in each time before you press record. This means no more filming in the auto mode. I know, it's unfortunate. First off, go into your settings and you want to make sure you're shooting on the highest quality, and on this GoPro MAX, it's going to be 5.6K. And you want your frame rate to be at 24 frames a second, as that's going to give us the most cinematic looking footage. If you're unsure and want to learn what different frame rates mean, you can click up here and go check that out. So now that we have the quality on lockdown, we're going to scroll down to the Pro Tune settings and start adjusting those, because this is what can really make or break your footage. Starting with the shutter speed, and on this GoPro MAX, it's unfortunate because the highest shutter speed we can go to is 1/384, which is unfortunate, and I don't know why they limited us to this. But without the option to run ND filters, the shutter speed is basically useless. Unless you're shooting at first light or last light, you may be able to use this. But other than that, and for most scenarios, we're gonna have to leave it on auto. Next is the EV comp. This can add or subtract up to 2 stops of exposure, and for most daytime shooting, I find myself using -1 or -2. Moving down to the white balance, and a good rule of thumb is if you're filming in any daylight, you're gonna want that set at 5500K. This chart's gonna help you determine what white balance is gonna be best for your scenario. Next up, we have the ISO minimum and ISO maximum. This controls how much artificial light the camera is gonna add for different situations. If it's a bright sunny day and you find yourself in some shade, the camera is automatically going to expose for that depending on the differences of your ISO, and that's not something that you want. It's important to be in control of this, as you don't want your exposure fluctuating. The best way is see which ISO exposes your scenario the best. I typically expose for the sky. Then once you have that, make sure your minimum and maximum are both set to the same number, and this way you don't get any fluctuating in the exposure. You want to try and stick to the lowest number as possible. I keep both of my ISOs at 100, as the higher the number you go, the more grain is going to be produced in your image. Now moving on to the sharpness, and you're going to want that on low. This will soften up the image to help give more of a cinematic feeling, as well as it's still quite sharp. And you can always add more sharpening in post if you decide you do want more. Now for the color, this one needs to be on flat. Yes, this will require color grading, but the benefits are worth it. In this flat profile, you get way more dynamic range, which means that it's going to pick up the highlights as well as the shadows much more. It's much easier to color as well as get an accurate image, whereas the GoPro color profile is much more saturated, as well as there are very little adjustments you can make to the image. And that leads us right into tip number 2, which is going to be color grading. This one is pretty crucial, as this one can add depth as well as separate your footage from others and make it stand out. There's definitely a fine line when it comes to color grading GoPro footage. That's why it's so important to film in the flat profile, as it gives us more dynamic range and gives us so many more options to adjust the image. Whereas the GoPro color profile is way too saturated and you have way less room to adjust it before it starts falling apart. And by falling apart, I mean it starts to get grainy as well as you start seeing banding. That's why it's very crucial to get your settings and exposure right before you press record. If you want a good starting point or want to check out the LUTs that I use to color grade my GoPro footage, I'll leave a link below. Other than getting your camera settings dialed in, this next tip might be the most crucial, and that is filming at the correct time of the day. Prioritize filming in the mornings or later in the day towards sunset, but stay away from filming in the middle of the day if possible. This is very important for a few reasons. One being the lighting is usually a lot more soft, as well as much more contrasting in the mornings and later in the day. Whereas in the middle of the day, the lighting tends to be very harsh and flat. When you compare the morning to the middle of the day, you can obviously tell that the one filmed in the morning looks much better. And as long as you have your settings set up right, the contrast of the mornings and sunsets shouldn't matter. Second reason is, it's usually less bright at both of these times, which means you can run a lower shutter speed, which in turn gives you more motion blur and a more cinematic feeling. Even though most likely your shutter speed will still be on auto, it will still automatically adjust to a lower speed, as there just isn't as much light as there would be during the middle of the day. You'll also notice that the colors of everything are more vibrant, as well as everything just simply looks better. But none of this matters if you poorly mount your GoPro, because let's face it, we've all been there. And yes, I know it's pretty hard to miss a shot with a 360 camera, but if you want your footage to stand out even more, then click here to see some unique GoPro mounts, and I'll see you over there. Peace.